Let's take a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 8 to 12 today. I'm going to open this with a question for you, just a reflection question. And tell me what you think. More of a yes or no kind of a question right now. Is having wealth morally bad? Is having wealth morally bad? Anybody out loud? No. Anybody else? It depends how you define wealth. Okay. How would you define wealth then? It doesn't necessarily have to be monetarily valuable. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm speaking on monetary, like in the sense of having resources. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Is having wealth morally bad or morally wrong? The answer is, like we say in Italian, zni. That's yes and no together, sí and no. Okay? It can be. So everyone says, no, it's not wrong. Well, yes, it can be, because that all depends on you, actually, when you come to it on wealth. And that's why Solomon spends all these verses. He writes 2 entire chapters here. He writes other chapters in Proverbs, warning us about the dangers of wealth instead of saying that it's just all bad. See, if he had said that it was all bad, then he would have said, and the Bible would have been saying, stay away from it altogether, avoid it, try to remain as poor and desperate as you possibly can for the rest of your life, because that is true godliness. But instead, he doesn't do that. He says, no, yes, there is the part of obtaining wealth, earning money, and having wealth because God gives it to us. The difference is that you have to watch out for the dangers in wealth, because what God is giving to you is some of his own power when you have wealth. Now, 2 weeks ago, I spoke on the message and I called it Slow Down, Child. Because Ecclesiastes 5 starts with our approach to the presence of God. And he talks about a person who runs into the presence of God, making false promises or promises that are not well thought through. Someone who doesn't know how to worship God well or practice the sovereignty of God, the presence of God in their daily lives, the providence of God. The approach from that person, any worshiper, is from the fields where they worked into the temple. So they're going to worship. Now Solomon turns the story around and says, now as you're coming out of worship, how will you practice the presence of God in the places where you work when you come out of the temple? Solomon, in the first 7 verses, said, your words really matter. God listens to what we say. He's listening now. Be careful for what you say. And now Solomon says in these verses, your money really matters in how you appropriate it. Now he says this, it's interesting, he gave 7 verses on your words really matter, but he's going to use from verse 8 all the way to the end of chapter 6 to tell us how your money matters. Okay? So these whole 2 chapters, the rest of them, all the way to the end, will be speaking about the wisdom of wealth that God has given. And we're going to have a mini-series inside of this series. It's going to be Life Unfiltered about your wealth and how you can enjoy your daily bread that God has given to you. Part 1 today, okay? So in these, all of these verses are built into a construct. The construct begins and ends with the aspect that wealth leaves us unsatisfied if we only look to wealth, okay? Then the next movement in the scriptures, both times are mentioned that there is a grievous evil under the sun that Solomon talks about when wealth when we try to satisfy our lives with wealth, there becomes this grievous evil. But then in the middle of the whole construct, between verse 8 to the end of chapter 6, there are the verses 18 to 20, and that is his fulcrum. That is the apex of the teaching on the wisdom of wealth. And there is no possible way, as I was studying, that I can get all of this into one message, because I just don't have the capability to do that. There are some other guys who can, but I think you'll miss a lot of the richness that comes from this if we go too fast. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get us back into the part of why, first of all, Solomon deals with this aspect of not being satisfied in contentment. I want to spend a little bit of time, I want to get us back to the aspect of why does God actually want us to earn money and to do well at earning money? And how should we approach that? And so I've got to give some background and biblical context from the past and Israel in this, because our day and our world is going to be different. We're going to go back and forth. And so this is going to provide a contextual message for the messages ahead, okay, as we have this series. Now, I mentioned to you that verses 18 to 20, or 18 and 19, are the central apex to his teaching on the on wisdom of wealth. Now, on both sides of those verses talk about promises of joy and delight. On both sides of those verses, reading before and after, there are two dangers to wealth which tempt us to view money as more than mist. You remember in Ecclesiastes, we see the word vanity, but we know that means hevel, that's the Hebrew word, which means mist or vapor. So it is something there. It's not just vanity as a concept or as an image projection, but rather something that we can put our hands on or experience for a little while, but you can't trap it. So Solomon says, as he looks at this, there's two temptations that will take you into looking at the mist of wealth, but wealth and making more out of it, more than mist. You will think that it answers more problems than it actually does. Why? Because one day you have money and the next day you don't. That's how it works in life. Some of you are nodding because last week you did have some money and this week you don't, right? Because it's gone away. It's a mist. The two temptations on the nature of wealth on either side of the joy and contentment and delight in life of verses 18 to 20 that we will read are these two dangers: lack of contentment. And what Solomon gets at in the bigger picture is having wealth and being satisfied with it are not the same thing. You can have wealth, but you can be highly dissatisfied in life as well. They don't go together. So having wealth, making more money does not mean happier life quality, satisfaction. Solomon wants us to know that. And that's a problem with contentment in our own lives. The second one is capability. I've called it the temptation for the capability of joy from wealth. And that is, we'll find that down in verse 19, where God gives us not only wealth, but also the power to enjoy it. That's where I pulled the word enjoy your daily bread, because it's right in our text, right at the center of the construct of these two chapters. Everybody with me so far? All right? So in this, God wants us to not only make money, but he wants us to enjoy it under him. But you can't enjoy it if you don't submit it to him and you don't see it as a gift from him. And that's the power to enjoy it that he gives. We're going to explore that over the next couple messages. So I won't be able to get all of that in today. I just wanted to give you the framework of where the temptations are. So basically it is, I want to have wealth because I want to be happy. Well, you can't be happy unless God gives you that power to actually enjoy what you have. The richer that you become, the more you only see the impacts of your wealth and don't actually experience them. We'll see that in the text as well. So, friends, you can't enjoy God's daily bread given to you simply unless you earn it first. Well, I thought everything was by grace. Yes, God's giving you a grace to give you a job and a reason to live and a purpose to care for our families. He wants us to earn our money. He wants us to work to provide for our families, our nuclear family and our greater church family. These are all the families of God in there, all right? So today, I'm just going to give you the outline. I don't know if we're going to get through in our first sermon today or in the first service today. I did not get through it, and so I might just have to navigate on the fly for it. So otherwise, I'm trying to be your lunch hero. You just won't ever get out for lunch if I don't do this. So let me give the three of these things. If we get to this, we'll get to what we can do. How about that? And we'll come back to what we can't this next week. So first 2 points, how do you enjoy your daily bread? Part 1, first you earn, second you earn, and 3, you enjoy, all right? The first one, the point that we want to major on over these next minutes is going to be the moral necessity of earning your daily bread, of working in the gift of the job that God has given to you, or using the talents, abilities, capabilities, innovation, creativity, health, skills, and capacities that God has given to you to do well, to help yourself or others to earn. How about that? That's what a business owner would do. Or that's what someone would do in supporting, if you will, missional businesses that would open up and do good things, noble things for society. I don't want to get too much into that, but I want to show you why doing and holding a good job and seeing it from the Lord is a gift to be used. The responsibility that you have is a moral necessity to live in that. First, let me read our texts, and then we'll come back in and work through them, okay? Chapter 5, verse 8. Solomon says, you come out of the temple after you've paid your vows to God, and if you look into the province, and there's oppression of the poor, the vulnerable, and the violation of justice and righteousness, which should not happen in the land of God's people, don't be amazed. Don't be shocked. Really, this is a phrase that means don't be dismayed or desperate because of this at the matter. For the high official is watched by an even higher official, and there are yet even higher ones over them. How can Solomon say this? Because he was over all the other higher officials. He was top dog. Now, verse 9. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Okay, let's take the irony of that. Do you normally see a king dressed in robes working out as a farmer in the fields? No. But he says it is profit, it is healthy, it is prosperous for a people, a land, if a king is serving in his wisdom as the top man to be able to get all the way to the level of the farmer for the good of the people. So he's taking his wisdom and he's serving the people, and when he does, so that he will get all the way to ground level, grassroots level, literally, so that they will be a productive and resourceful and industrious people. And so Solomon is giving that wisdom of saying, if a king is looking out for his people, then he will clean up the corruption that we just saw in the last verse of people who take power and steal from the poor, make them even more vulnerable, and crush them only to get rich themselves, creating an oligarchy, an aristocracy, something like that. Something where they can profit off of the injustice, using their authority to make people more and more vulnerable in society. Solomon says that's not a healthy way to have a healthy society. We see that happening in our society. We do. So if we can, in our leaders, have ones, our spiritual leaders, our political leaders, etc., have people who are dedicated to using the wisdom and the leadership God's given them to cultivate the fields at ground level, then that's what he's saying is draw the distance. Don't let your leaders be too out of touch with where everybody else is living. You might not feel that's all that important, but it's critical coming up, because think about Solomon's life now. Solomon's life, he started out really well. He had a magnificent amount of wisdom he was using to do what? To help and judge rightly for the people. And as he helped them and judged rightly, then they began to prosper as a nation like never before. It was the golden age of Israel. But later in Solomon's reign, what happened? He put them into all these building projects, and he started to oppress the people, so that by the time Solomon was done with his reign, they all hated him. They were disgusted with him because they even asked his son, could you just lighten up a little bit in your reign as compared to your father? Because he ended up oppressing his own people as he got richer and richer and accumulated more and more pacts and alliances and wives. And so that's why verse 9 it's tricky to translate, but there is some depth to wisdom that's in there because the vulnerable need the king working in their lives. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth will ever be satisfied with his income. This is also vapor. In other words, you have the money for a moment, but you're not satisfied because you either want more or it goes away. Okay? When goods increase, they increase those who eat them. So if you gain money, you have more dependents that you have to feed. So you watch the dependents feed them, or you watch your money feeding the dependents that you have to resource. What profit or advantage has their owner but only to see his goods eaten away? Only see them with his eyes. He never gets to enjoy them, his resources. He's always given them away. Okay? So it's not really an advantage to have and accumulate a lot of stuff. So Solomon gives an alternate thing that we'll probably get to next week. And he says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer. You ever had money worries? Financial concerns, anxieties over issues financially? A lot of times it can keep you up at night. And so sleep gets disturbed, but not for a laborer who eats little or much, but rather the full stomach of the rich, and he's speaking ironically here, the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. You would think if somebody's satisfied, completely satisfied, ate really good Italian food, that he would be comfortable enough to sleep. But no, his worries of his riches keep him up at night, where the one who doesn't have the money to eat nice food and maybe doesn't even have a full stomach because he's worked well under God, what does he do? He gets sweet sleep and rest. It doesn't keep him up at night because he's accepted what God has given him, whereas maybe the rich man has fallen into this part of not being satisfied. Now let's just look at verses 18 to 20 because everything's going to point there in our messages. So Solomon says, because of that, look what I have seen to be good and fitting. It's to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun. So you've gotten work to do. That's the word toil. You have work to do. And eat and drink and do it and be occupied with it. Why? Because God has given it to him. See that? God has given it him. For this is his lot. This is God writing your story. It's what he's given you in life. That really helps us to not be so competitive in comparison. Like I have to keep up with the Harrises. I'm sorry, the Joneses. I'm just kidding. Saw you over there and came to mind. The other Harrises. Oh yeah, over there. Okay. Keep up with the Joneses. All right. I'm comparing myself on a socioeconomic ladder, and I need to keep up with them. And so in this, there's a jealousy, etc. But God hasn't even given you that lot. Okay. And so the jealousy can come from both sides, really. Now God has given it to him. I want you to see there are 5 things that God gives in these verses. Everything, food, eat, drink, sleep, rest, work, toil, it's all given by God. Everyone also to whom God has given, there it is again, wealth and given possessions and given the power to enjoy them and to accept his lot. So there's 2, power to enjoy and then to say, this is what God has given to me, accept, whether it's small or great. This is the gift of God. Verse 20, why? Because he will not remember much the days of his life, all the hardships and the vexations and the struggles and the pains and the bad memories, because God fills his heart, keeps him occupied. He's busy, but he fills his heart with joy. Joy. And so, as these are written here, I can just plainly tell you, God wants to fill your heart with daily joy. That's why we say, enjoy your daily bread that he has given to you. And we'll be coming back and pulling from these verses, or actually finalizing a lot of our points in these verses over the coming messages, okay? Now, we're going to talk about earning your daily bread because it's a moral necessity a little bit more. Today we have a dilemma. In our day with the dilemma is, we have three actually. The first dilemma is that we have material abundance. We have far much more wealth than our great-grandparents ever had, if I can say that, in every generation in this day. Historically, our generation is probably one of the wealthiest in all of Western history up to this day. And what that's done for the church is it causes believers to take our provision that God actually gives to us for granted. So this is a dilemma we have. Like, a lot of times we go and we drive our cars and we fill them up with fuel, or we charge them up, or we eat our food, we have full 3 meals, or some of us full 7 or 8 meals a day, but we never stop and just count how beautiful it is of who gave this to me. Because the material abundance makes us feel entitled to it. Like, I deserve this because this is where I'm from. And that comes in, and God says, I've been giving you all of this abundance and wealth so that you will turn to me. Romans chapter 2 and verse 4. You can read it right there. So you'll come to me. You will see my face beyond my hand and the gifts that I'm giving to you. So are you praying and thanking God, not just for the food, but for him who gave it to you? When you bless your meals, for example, if you bless your meals, I want to encourage you to bless them. If you bless your meals, you start right there in the little things. This is so that you don't take for granted the provision of God or him being active in your life. God, you are to be blessed. Your name is to be blessed because you're the king of the world and you give me this abundance. Thank you for the food that we are about to eat. You see, it's not just bless this food and thank you for the food. It's God bless you and thank you for the food that you are giving to me. I see it as your act of provision, kindness. Second dilemma that we face when it comes to wealth that separates out the idea of moral necessity is that oftentimes in our churches, we teach on selective biblical passages and warnings about wealth. And we almost make it like wealth is bad, inherently bad. It is not inherently bad, okay? It's inherently neutral. The ancient Jewish sages called it frozen work, if you held money in your hand. So there's a power and there's work in there. I'll talk about that farther ahead. And so it's this, there's a power in it, and if it goes in your hand and your character is bad, or it's not in line with God's word, then of course money can be used for bad things. It will go astray because it's an instrument. It all depends on whose hands it's in and who's sitting on the money. And so sometimes, rightly so, we will preach on consumerism and materialism, which are false gods as well. But it can also represent sometimes that wealth and wealth building and making money is a wrong thing to do, and saving money is wrong. And I don't want to do that because I don't think Solomon is doing that here as well. Third issue that is a dilemma that makes us not feel it's a moral necessity is in our society we have detached the incentive of education and work from the moral obligation to provide. A lot of young people in Gen Z today are coming out saying, I studied so I could have a job just so that the job will fulfill me. And if this job doesn't fulfill me, then I'm not going to be happy, okay? But in this case, the biblical image is absolutely upside down from that. We don't just find a job that's just going to fulfill me, because that's selfish. God gives us work so that we might fulfill his mandate and we might fulfill creation's order, okay? And specifically, provide well for our families. But not only for our families, but for our society, for our church families, for those even around us. And we've we've taken that moral obligation and we've detached it from our education systems. We've just said, you do what fulfills you, instead of incentivizing them into saying, this is very good to learn, so for this skill, this is how it will help provide for your family and also for your people. Now, in Solomon's day, he had a couple things that were different in the dilemma than what we have today. In his day, his dilemma was corruption and despair. We already saw the corruption of the higher ups on the chain. All right? In verse 8, I'll pull this back. These were the corrupt officials who loved money and used their power over the poor. It made them more and more vulnerable. So he says there, and again, I call your attention back to, don't be dismayed or disillusioned by this. Why? Because there is one who is even higher than the king, and that is God. And so that's what we find in verse 18 and 20. Now, in verse 9, the corruption and the despair that is there is that the king is supposed to invest his wisdom into the cultivation of fields at grassroots level. Why? Because wealth protects the vulnerable. The poor are very susceptible to oppression precisely because they lack the resources to protect themselves. Right? So if someone comes in and a poor family is struggling, it's paycheck to paycheck, right? And is struggling to do that, what happens when someone comes and takes and steals their old secondhand car that's keeping the family going? They don't have enough money. It's gone. Insurance probably isn't going to pay out because they were already trying to keep it together with small repairs. Now it's gone. They don't have any more money to be able to buy another car, but they have to get kids to school. They got to get to work. And it was the one family car, right? And then to be able to try to get the car, they pull the money from the rent that they owe from a landlord who has been jacking up the rent more and more on them. And so now they're tempted with what? I need to find money. They're vulnerable to bad loans, getting liquidity at very high rates, being crushed, or putting things, in our case, putting things on credit cards, maxing out credit cards. Spending future seed and money already, making the decision before the Lord's ever given it to us. That's what happens when we max out credit cards. Now, if they had had the money, then they wouldn't have had the temptation, right? Having money, wealth, brings other temptations, but not this one. They wouldn't have had the temptation to open themselves maybe up to loan sharks or others who would give them liquidity at high interest rates and be stolen from. They didn't have the protection. So money does provide protection. They could have paid the rent and bought a decent car, maybe even two, if they had had a decent income. Okay? So it's worth educating ourselves and teaching our children to get a good job, because a good income, it doesn't have to be a massive income. Great, it's what God gives to us. A good income can provide for a family, and that is morally good. It will protect you. I know that nobody in here ever goes to their work on Monday. These are all people who might watch this message at a future time on our YouTube channel, right? But nobody ever goes to work on Monday and complains about your job, because you all love your workplace and your jobs, and you bless. Many of you bless the USAF every Monday when you start over again. I'm sure that you do. And nobody complains. But there are some Italian workers out here who do complain about their jobs, okay? Did you notice that one of the joys of this is whether the government shut down for a long time or not, okay? I'm just going to caveat that. Hopefully this is a temporary one for you all. But let me put it this way. If you didn't have that work, it is a job that God gave to you, and it is providing for you. If you didn't have that, you would be at risk from a tax that you don't ever have to face. that there are people in our other congregation who do face on a regular basis just because they don't have the mid-level income that a lot of us do here. So that's a definite gift. There is protection in it. Also, good work for our society prevents oppression. See here, a king is committed to cultivating the fields will ensure that at all baseline levels in society, there's productivity, there's work, there are more jobs, there's employment. And so they're working on cultivating good business principles and good, healthy market principles so that others can be able to find jobs. And we have a big struggle with that. There is work out here, but because of all the different rules, it's really hard for people to be able to find jobs. Often our church has to represent our king who wants them to be able to work and provide for their family. So we have to go find jobs for others as well. And many of our donations here help benevolently other families who are trying hard to get the jobs done. And so your giving is also a part of your work because it will protect and prevent oppression. Now, in Solomon's day too, the provision was a defense. It was a defense because in a world that was scarred by the sin of Adam, financial stability provides protection for these families. When we're poor, we are highly vulnerable to wickedness, practicing it ourselves, and having it practiced against us. In a world that's scarred by sin, you're never going to get rid of the wickedness. And so what do? If you are poor, and yet you're open to this attack, well, Solomon's counsel is train, work hard, get a job, and stay at it for 50 years as God gives you this lot. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't complain about that. That is a good thing. Yeah, but I didn't get to that level. All right. Did you work toward that level? Yes. Well, then God didn't give it to you in your lot. Are you thankful for the level that God gave you? Because it protected you from that lower level down there. Don't you see that? You see, so there's a sense of contentment that has to be, also a sense of moral obligation to do this because when we don't take our moral responsibility to provide and work well, we are exposing ourselves and our families and our community to a lot of attack that we just don't see. Okay? Now, in ancient Israel, all right, there was wealth acquisition, and accumulating wealth and saving it was inseparable from covenant faithfulness. It was inseparable from covenant faithfulness. Making money was part of doing the covenant with God. That sounds kind of nice. Now, think about it. The promised land was called the promised land because every Israelite in their family could go into their tribes and the promised land and find a place to cultivate and have a field and a home. That's why it was a promised land. They could do work at it. And they were responsible for it. So who brought the Israelites into the promised land? It's God. Who gave them that land? God. Who separated the tribes and gave them all the parcels of land and their families? Who gave them their families? God, right? So now, once God gives you a gift, family, home, place, work, you have a responsibility. Even Spider-Man says that. Those with more power, whatever it was, have more responsibility. Okay? Pop culture reference, done. All right, now, each family received from a portion of their tribal territory. So you could have been in the tribe of Zebulun or up in the north of Naphtali by the Sea of Galilee. And you get your plot and your work, and it wasn't just so you could sit back and enjoy the panorama. Sea of Galilee is very beautiful, by the way. But the young men were to be trained, and they were morally obligated because God gave them all of that. All young men, and since you're all young men here today, speaking with you, this is what you would have had to have done. You would have all had to have learned agricultural skills, or fishing skills if it was on the lake there, from your parents, which means your parents were obligated to do what? To teach you how to work with your hands. You were supposed to save, you were morally obligated to save, to purchase necessary equipment, to better your farm and your industry. you were to develop and increase the land's productivity, decultivate and recultivate it. And then you were to provide for your extended family and sojourners, foreigners who were coming into the land. You were obligated to give them a welcome from the Lord because he gave you those gifts. And he said he would provide the fruit to covenant Israel, and he would provide the harvest for them so that the foreigners could be welcomed in and see him, that he had given them the gifts. It's a beautiful thing. So it was more than just for myself. Look at all the eggplant that we grew this year. Ooh, we're going to have a lot of great fruit here, pomegranates, until next summertime to eat. No, it wasn't just for them. It was for extended family and for others who they didn't even know. You see, it would be completely incomprehensible to them if you were to say this. Well, I got a degree for me, but there's nothing around this place, this family home and heritage that really fulfills me. It just doesn't make enough money. I don't really care about money because I've got a lot of subsidies, got a lot of bills that are, handouts, and it's all coming from Jerusalem. They would have, if a young man of Israel had said something like that, if a young man of Israel had come in and said, I just want to love the Lord, money isn't really that big of a deal in my life, they would be like, what are you talking about? How are your children going to eat? How are you going to survive? That's morally incomprehensible. See, they would have been really upset at that. In fact, for most young men who were single, they were like, how are you ever going to marry? Because there is no woman in her right mind who is going to see you sitting back trying to enjoy your personalized self-styled career, but not providing for a family. They're looking for those who are covenant faithful in the covenant before the Lord. Okay? Does that make sense? Now I'm trying to root it down into the moral obligation of the covenant. There was a purpose in the covenant. And the purpose that God gave the covenant for, he says in Exodus 20, was to experience the mercy and compassion of God to 1,000 generations. It was to display God's generosity and his goodness to the nations. Think about it this way. If you had foreigners that were coming and seeing Israel, and they came into the land, and everywhere they went, they saw integrated families, they saw cultivated fields that were prospering, they saw every tribe maintaining themselves, they would have looked around and said, where are your idols, or where are your statues? Because if you have this kind of prosperity, that's who I want to worship. They would have been looking for the gods, because remember in that day, every tribe, every people worshiped some god that would give them fertility, bounty, wealth. So they would have come into Israel and seen all of this abundance, God providing the harvest and everything, and the saving and the accumulation of wealth, and they would have said, where are the statues? I want to go to the shrine. And all they would have had to do is say what? Oh, but we worship the one God, Yahweh. You can go up to Jerusalem, and you can see from the center of Jerusalem, you can know about him. But you can see his goodness to us out here, and you can go to the center of where it is. All right? Now, that was a display of God's goodness to the nations, to know that he exists. And when they would come as sojourners, Yahweh would open the welcome because the families would care for them even with their own fields. But if they never farmed them, and they never cared for these gifts from God, well, then they would have never been able to obey God. Now, what this also does is, it was meant to pass on a future, an inheritance, to the next generations. It was meant to teach the next generations covenant loyalty, not just to give them empty, raw money. But it was to say, this money is attached to covenant loyalty. You saw all your life where it came from. Now you go out and do the same. And the nation increases. So what would they do to do the same? God set it up in the Old Testament for, this is how they would make their money that they would save. And it was this. They installed gleaning laws. God gave them laws for how they would farm their fields. The first one was that they had to leave all the borders of their field unharvested. So they could only farm the middle, kind of like when we eat a pizza and don't eat the crust. Okay, so there's all in the middle, and they took that. But the reason for that was so that foreigners, when they came, they could come and they could have a portion of harvest, all right, that was enough for them to work that day and get by for that day. They also would, any grain that was dropped, like when they were cutting it or harvesting it, if it was dropped on the ground, they wouldn't go back and pick up grain by grain by grain. They would leave that in the field. God said, leave that there because that's another way of work, okay? Olive trees, which we have many of out here, they would only shake once. They'd take the first harvest from it, okay, and then they would leave the remaining olives there. This was all part of the work, and the principle was there was provision for you and fruit for you if you were willing to work, and we see that played out in the book of Ruth. You guys remember Ruth? She came and she was working in the field of Boaz. She had never been there before, but she was able to glean, and Noemi says, where did you get all this food? It's wonderful. Now, it took, what that would do is that would show compassion for the needy, incentive for rewarding labor. It would bring responsibility to the whole community, and it would require individual initiative and responsibility from everyone. So it wasn't just handouts. It was workouts together, okay? Now, the reason I bring this up, and we'll get close to our closing here, is in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8. The Apostle Paul comes in the New Testament, and he says some strong language, which can often confuse us. But if we connect it with Solomon and understanding what the Hebrew culture was like, then we can understand what God wants us to do. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his members of his own family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So here he equates failure to provide with a denial of the actual faith, of the gospel. He says he's worse than an unbeliever. Why? Why would Paul even say that? Because an unbeliever was one who didn't care about his family or his people, all right? Because he didn't care about the God who gave him all these things. An unbeliever for them would be one who was willing to consume even his family and his people to be able to get rich. He was corrupt. You see? And Paul is saying he didn't recognize God's covenant. So he said, yeah, Jesus came, Jesus died, Jesus was the riches from heaven, etc. Yes, I get that. But yet, in his activity, he was acting more like a greedy unbeliever because the signs of it was that he just didn't care for the family. You see, he wasn't fulfilling his covenant faithfulness to God. The covenant is the salvation covenant that we live in Christ. So this is not a suggestion, but it's a moral imperative. And I want you just to see the connections. Watch how this works. We'll start here. It's a chain, okay? Ancient Israel would farm the land. They would feed the family. That would display God's goodness. They would open a welcome to the nations, and then they would pass on the blessing. So the Apostle Paul says, look back at that. In here, a person is worse than an unbeliever because an unbeliever won't do this because they're not passing on anything. He's consuming the wealth for himself. There's greed here. In the New Testament, it says you earn sufficiently. You provide for the household, your household, and the household of God. You display God's goodness. That's a witness to the world. And then you disciple the next generation. And you cultivate that in the next generation. So it's not just working to get rich. That's not the legacy that we want to leave to our children. It's working well to be able to have a greater relationship and loyalty to God because he gives you more gifts in which you can distribute into the world. And you can't do that if you can't earn enough money to provide for your family. You simply just can't, that chain just breaks down. And so in this, it is a good thing to do it, but it all depends on our heart, you see. Now, your heart has to be in line with Christ. And we talked about that verse 9. I'll just go back to this, and this is where we'll have a sense of gospel contentment here. a king committed to those working in the fields, cultivating the fields. Jesus was committed to that. In fact, he committed his whole life, didn't he? He didn't grasp at authority, but he descended down into our world. And he worked in the fields, and he worked as a carpenter. And he was a king committed to the cultivation of what? The fields of people. And he brought about a harvest. And today his harvest is us. And how do you get into that harvest? That harvest is recognizing that all of the wealth of heaven and everything that involves wealth is contained in Christ Jesus. And therefore, we have to surrender all of the power we think we have, the control we think we have, the finances, the resources, the money that we think we have and we own. We need to submit it to the King and surrender to him, because he wants to take your life and cultivate it again into the fields where we live right here and right now. Cultivate it in the field of your shop, to the base, to anyone, your neighbors. He wants to take your life, but you have to surrender. And one of the first places that you surrender, Solomon says, is in your money. In your money. Well, who are you working for? Are you working by grace? Are you motivated by grace? Or are you motivated by career path? Are you motivated for the Lord, or who are you working for? Or are you for that comfort that comes, that delight? Because friends, I've got to be honest with you, it's never enough. It's always vapor. And it will always go. Why? Because God's the one who gives it anyway. And this is the ironic part. He gives you a gift by which you can rival him to begin with. He gives you money and resources, and he wants to see what you will do with it. Will you worship with it? Are you motivated by love for him? Or if you're not, will you go out and spend it to show what's really and reveal what's really in your own heart? And this is his call back to him, to receive him, to know him, to be blessed by him, because if you walk away from him, he will take it away one day, whether you realize that or not. Whether he takes it away in your lifetime or he takes it away when your lifetime finishes. God is over your money. So what are you working for? Why are you working so hard? What's the motivation, right? And do you see it as a motivation of grace?